In this video, we're going to talk about a second type of associative learning. Previously, we described classical conditioning, and this was a relatively passive and automatic process. Operant conditioning is different, and we're going to be covering that in this video. Operant conditioning is the way in which behaviors change based on consequences. This work was first formalized by Edward Thorndike when he described the law of effect back in 1927. He used puzzle boxes with cats inside trying to learn how to escape from the box, and we'll look at this in class. And the law of effect was extended by B.F. Skinner, who was most active from the 1930s to the 1960s. And he pioneered something called a Skinner box, which is a behavioral test chamber often used with mice and rats. We'll look at both of these experimental setups in class. So the law of effect states that the consequences of a response determine whether the tendency to respond again will be strengthened or weakened. So that's a lot of words. So what does this really mean? Well, if a behavior results in something good, then it will tend to be repeated. Whereas if a behavior results in something bad, has a negative result, the behavior will tend to not be repeated. So let's talk through an example of each of these. So for the behavior that is reinforced or that will tend to be repeated, we might be looking at how studying hard results in getting a good grade. This will lead to the tendency for you to study hard in the future. Whereas here, if the behavior is sleeping through an exam and the result is a failed exam, then this result will make it less likely that you'll sleep through an exam in the future. So here we see a difference between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Here with operant conditioning, we have the behavior occurs before the stimulus, and the stimulus then shapes the tendency of future behaviors. Operant conditioning also usually involves voluntary behaviors. Whereas with classical conditioning, we saw that the stimulus occurred before the response, and the responses that we were looking at were usually automatic or non-voluntary. So within the operant conditioning framework, we say that our behavior, and that of animals, is controlled and modulated by environmental consequences. And we classify 4 different types of operant conditioning, which can be tricky to differentiate, and we'll practice with this differentiation in class. We can draw out a chart to show these 4 types. We can have a behavioral response either increase, and we're putting this on this side of our chart, or we can have the behavioral response decrease. We're talking about the tendency for this response or behavior to occur again in the future. And then up here on this side of our chart, we see that the change in the behavioral tendency occurs after we have some stimulus. And the stimulus can either be added, which we'll have in this column, or the stimulus can be removed. Either way, this change in stimulus results in a change in the behavioral tendency later on. So when we have a response increasing, we say this is reinforcement. We're increasing the tendency for the behavior to occur more. We're reinforcing this behavior or this response, making it more likely to occur. So here, when we're adding a stimulus, we call this positive, and it's reinforcement. The stimulus is going to tend to increase the likelihood that the response or behavior occurs in the future. So for example, if we have a child that finishes their chores and is given a cupcake, the cupcake is an added stimulus, so this is positive, and this will tend to increase the likelihood the child finishes chores in the future, so we would call this reinforcement. This is positive reinforcement. The behavior is completing the chores, which is reinforced by the cupcake. We can also have negative reinforcement when we remove a stimulus or take something away. For example, if a teenager is nice to a sibling and the parent removes the teen's curfew, in this case, the early curfew is a stimulus that's being removed, and the effect of this change in stimulus would be to reinforce the teenager to treat the sibling nicely. So we would increase the tendency for this nice behavior to occur in the future. When we see a behavior tend to decrease in frequency after a stimulus, we call this punishment. So this is what we have on the bottom row of our chart. With positive punishment, a stimulus is added, which leads to a reduction in a particular response or behavior in the future. So punishment represents the decrease in response tendency. So, for example, nail biting will decrease when followed by the taste of a bitter substance painted on the nails. So in this case, we're adding a stimulus, this bitter tasting substance. So it's positive. And this stimulus is going to lead to a reduction in the tendency to bite the nails in the future. So this would be punishment. We're reducing the tendency of the behavior going forward. And finally, we get to negative punishment. This is where we remove a stimulus or take something away. That's the negative part. And we see that the occurrence of the behavior will tend to decrease going forward. So that's punishment. So, for example, a child fights with her brother and has her favorite toy taken away. The stimulus is removed, the toy, and we see that the result of this stimulus removal is that the tendency to keep fighting will be reduced. That's what's conditioned in this case. So let's recap this one more time. I'll just copy this chart down below and I'm going to summarize without examples, but just describing what's going on. So here in the top left, we have positive reinforcement. We have something added, a stimulus, to increase the likelihood of a behavior, positive reinforcement. Over here, we have negative reinforcement. Something is removed, our stimulus is removed, to increase the likelihood of a behavior. Down here, we have positive punishment, where something is added to decrease the likelihood of a behavior. And over here we have negative punishment, where something is removed to decrease the likelihood of a behavior. So these are the 4 different types of operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is a form of associative learning, where we're associating a stimulus with a response. And if we're given a learning scenario that fits into the operant conditioning framework, it can be tricky to identify what type of operant conditioning is happening. And so we'll get lots of practice with different scenarios in class.